After the sinking of a cargo ship, a young man spends more than 200 days adrift with a tiger, having to keep the predator fed so it doesn't become lunch. Today we're going to recap the story of the movie, Life of Pi, from 2012. Living in Canada, an Indian named Pi receives a visit from a writer named Jan Martel, who is looking for a good story for a book. Starting from the beginning, Pi tells us that his uncle was a keen swimmer and recommended that his father go to Piscine Molitor, one of the best clubs in France. Liking the idea, his father, Santosh, decided to name the club after his son, who was renamed Piscine Molitor Patel and given the nickname Pi. Everything was going well until the young man turned 11, when his classmates started calling him Pee-Pee, insinuating that he was still wetting the bed. To put an end to the nicknames, the young man tried to convince everyone that his name was based on pi, the irrational number, but despite his efforts, his classmates continued with the nicknames. After the story, Jan asks why Pi is considered a legend among sailors, and the man replies that he doesn't know how to sail, saying that he only survived because of a tiger called Richard Parker. Wanting to know more details, the writer asks to hear the rest of the story, and Pi decides to talk a little about the town where he was born, Pondicherry, which was once a French colony. After France returned the territory, the place started to grow a lot, and Santosh decided to open a zoo where the old botanical garden used to be. To work there, Santosh hired Geeta, who would later become his wife and the mother of his sons, Pi and Ravi. Through her influence, Pi got to know Hinduism and fell in love with the stories, but Santosh has always been against it, saying that religion is a waste of time. Despite this, the young man continued with his faith until he went to visit some relatives in the mountains. Instead, Ravi challenged his younger brother to go to the church and drink holy water, which led to Pi meeting the priest and also Jesus. Until the day he left, the young man returned to church several times and became more and more interested in the story of Jesus, becoming a Hindu Catholic. As if that wasn't enough, Pi also met Allah while passing through an Arab neighborhood, converting to a third religion. When Santosh hears about this, he starts picking on his son, saying that he can't accept everything blindly. In the present day, Jan asks how Piscine met Richard Parker, and the man tells him that when he was little, his father bought a tiger for the zoo. Wanting to meet him, Pi takes a piece of meat and opens the cage for the big cat to approach. As soon as he sees the animal, Ravi gets scared and runs away, but the younger young man remains glued to the railing, offering the piece of meat to the tiger that gets closer and closer. Just as the predator is about to reach his son, Santosh arrives and saves the young man, causing the tiger to run away in fright. Furious, the man says that animals are not his friends, and Pi disagrees, which makes Santosh determined to teach his son a lesson. With the help of an employee, he ties a goat to the bars and releases the cage for Richard Parker to approach. As soon as it sees its prey, the tiger goes into hunting mode and runs at full speed towards it, eliminating the goat and taking it inside to feed. After witnessing this, Piscine had a very dull life for the next few years, until he met a girl called Ananda during a music lesson. In love, Pi begins to get closer and closer to the girl, but everything goes downhill when the city council stops supporting the zoo and Santosh decides to move with his family to Canada. On the freighter to North America, Pi is sad to have to leave, and Geeta has to console her son. After the conversation, the woman takes the young man to dinner with her family, where the cook puts meat on Geeta's plate even after she tells him she's a vegetarian. Thinking it was a mistake, Santosh asks the cook in French to make a dish without meat, but the employee is extremely rude and disrespects his wife, which makes Santosh go after him. After the confusion, the family gets a plate of plain rice, which leaves everyone not wanting to eat. While they are at the table, a Buddhist approaches and says that while they are on the boat, they should at least accept the sauce because of its taste, but the family refuses anyway. After the meal, Pi accompanies his father to the cargo hold, where Santosh gives the animals tranquilizers to relieve their stress. That night, the ship was sailing near the Mariana Trench when it was hit by a storm. Wanting to see the rough sea, Pi gets up in the middle of the night and walks out onto the deck, where he sees the gigantic waves rocking the boat from side to side. Even with difficulty, the young man walks around the place marveling at the rain, but everything changes when the ship is hit by two colossal waves. Worried, Pi runs back to his room, where he realizes that the animals have been released and the room's flooded. Wanting to help, the young man tries to swim to his family, but can no longer reach them. Not knowing what to do, the teenager goes back on deck to ask for help, but the sailors tell him that everyone has already lost their lives and throw him into a lifeboat. As Pi tries to shout for his family, a desperate zebra jumps from the ship into the dinghy, causing the rope to snap and the boat to fall into the sea with only the young man in it. Alone and afraid, Pi blows the emergency whistle in an attempt to be heard, but to no avail. Not knowing what to do, the young man throws an emergency buoy into the water, but soon realizes it's useless and tries to pull it back out. Just then, Richard Parker appears and swims over to the buoy, making Piscine desperate. Using an oar, the young man tries to knock the tiger down, but it doesn't work and the animal ends up climbing into the wooden boat. Frightened, Pi jumps into the water when a giant wave is about to hit him, forcing him to dive in to avoid being swept away. While underwater, Pi sees the cargo ship heading towards the bottom of the ocean and his father's animals being eaten by sharks. Afraid of the same fate, the young man gets back into the dinghy and holds onto the oar while shouting for his family. After a stormy night, the day dawns with the sea a little calmer, allowing Pi to empty the dinghy with a bucket. Just as he finishes doing this, a hyena comes out from under the tarpaulin, which makes the young man retreat to the back of the dinghy. Because of the medication, the hyena can barely stand and Pi is a little calmer. While the young man is thinking about what to do, one of his father's orangutans floats up on some bananas and is rescued by Pi. Trying to alert anyone nearby, the young man starts banging the bucket against the ship's hull, which wakes up the hyena, who gets up in despair. While running around, the animal gets sick and ends up putting the tranquilizer out. After a few hours, the predator finally recovers and decides to attack the zebra, which, because its legs are broken, can't even stand up. Without the courage to interfere, Pi and the orangutan can only watch as the zebra is slaughtered by the hyena. The next morning, the young man wakes up and decides to look for supplies in the dinghy, finding a box with a sea survival guide and several life jackets, which he ties up with a fishing net and improvises a kind of raft. As soon as Pi finishes his trick, the hyena comes out from under the tarpaulin and starts attacking the orangutan, biting his neck. Wanting to avenge the primate, Pi takes a knife from his survival kit and begins to threaten the hyena, but Richard Parker is quicker and comes out from under the tarpaulin, eliminating the other predator with a single bite. Soon after, the tiger tries to go after Pi, but he can't balance himself on the tarpaulin and gives up. Seizing the opportunity, Pi throws himself into the water and climbs onto his makeshift raft, where he stays until he is surrounded by sharks. Frightened, the young man returns to the dinghy and begins to investigate under the tarpaulin, finding a large stock of food and drink for emergencies. Unable to believe his luck, Pi starts eating everything he can get his hands on when he sees a rat on top of the cans. While he's watching the rodent, the tiger appears and tries to attack him, but is again prevented by the tarpaulin. Walking under the fabric, the tiger crosses the raft and tries to get out the other side, but he can't get his whole body through and decides to return. To distract him, Pi throws the rodent towards the tiger and throws himself into the water, spending the cold night on his makeshift raft while the predator watches him. The next morning, Pi wakes up to extremely calm seas and decides to write about his experience in a logbook. After making his notes, the young man sees the tiger going under the tarpaulin and decides to pull up to see what it's doing, catching Richard Parker next to his prey. As the day progresses, Pi reads the survival guide again and discovers that seasickness is worse if the boat is on its side in the waves. With this information, the young man uses the dinghy's ropes to turn it on its side, while blowing a whistle in an attempt to make the tiger associate the noise with discomfort. Thinking that Richard Parker has had enough, Pi goes to the dinghy where he sees the predator putting everything out. More confident, the young man gets on top of the tarpaulin and tries to mark the territory as his own, but the tiger doesn't accept and throws a jet of his own scent in his face. Back on his raft, Pi collects rainwater and drinks as much as he can, giving everything that's left to the tiger. After almost a month adrift, the young man knows that Richard Parker will soon get hungry and come after him. To prevent this from happening, Pi prepares a bait to catch some fish, spending the whole afternoon trying to catch them. Tired of waiting, the tiger sees some tuna swimming nearby and decides to jump into the water to try and catch them, but the fish swim away and he decides to change his target, going after Pi. When he realizes this, the young man pulls the boat towards him and jumps as fast as he can, escaping at the last second. With the predator in the water, Pi pulls out his raft and can finally enjoy the boat on his own. With the axe from his survival kit, the young man goes up to the tiger and threatens to strike the final blow, but gives up at the last second. Repentant, Pi takes some planks of wood from the bottom of the dinghy and spends the day improving his raft, as well as getting all the food. When night falls, he throws his raft to one side and one of the planks to the other, jumping into the water while the predator climbs back into the raft. The next morning, a fish is swimming near the raft and ends up in Pi's net. Seizing the opportunity, the young man pulls the animal up and finishes it off with the axe, handing all the meat to the tiger. When night falls, a large number of jellyfish gather around the raft, making the ocean fluoresce. While Pi is watching the animals, a large whale appears and leaps out of the water, causing a huge wave that knocks the young man off the raft. As a result, Pi loses all the food that was with him, leaving only the cans of water that are floating around. Hungry, the young man decides to go back to the boat and face the tiger, but ends up being knocked down by a flying fish that hits him in the face. Right after the first, thousands of other fish glide past them as they flee from the tuna. Wanting one of the fish that falls into the boat, the young man and the tiger start to fight each other. But Pi doesn't back down and manages to keep the tuna, eating meat for the first time in many years. Tired of living in fear of Richard Parker, Pi decides that he will train the animal not to attack him, using a paddle to show that the tiger can't hurt him. After the predator has calmed down, the young man puts a piece of tuna on the end of his pole and gives it to the tiger to eat. Little by little, the young man manages to get Richard Parker to accept his presence and stay under the tarpaulin, finally allowing them to live together in peace. Together, the two spend the next few days fighting for survival. After a while, Pi is making music with the bucket when he sees a group of dolphins passing by. Looking at the horizon, the young man sees a ship in the distance and decides to fire a flare into the air. As the boat doesn't turn, Pi fires a second shot and tries to use the smoke flare, but the ship can't see him. Even so, the young man remains hopeful and stays up all night waiting for rescue, which doesn't come. After 48 hours without sleep, Pi realizes that Richard Parker is watching something and decides to go closer to see, having a hallucination in which he can see what is happening at the bottom of the ocean. There, a giant squid grabs a sperm whale and starts squeezing it, causing the whale's body to split into several animals from his father's zoo. Suddenly, each of them turns into a point of light and then organizes into bubbles, forming the lotus symbol and then Ananda's face. A little further down, Pi sees the freighter at the bottom of the ocean and finally comes back to reality. After several months, the young man uses the remaining piece of pencil to write his last words in his diary, saying that he can no longer tell the difference between his dream and reality. Looking at the horizon, Pi notices a storm approaching and begins to prepare. After the tiger goes under the tarpaulin, a gale takes the young man's diary and a wave knocks him into the water, causing him to lose his dinghy. Back in reality, Pi realizes that he is still on the boat in the middle of the storm. Suddenly, a beam of light illuminates a point in the ocean which is then struck by lightning. Thinking it's a message from God, Pi asks Richard Parker to come out from under the tarpaulin to see, but the waves get rougher and almost fill the dinghy. Because of the violence of the waters, Pi and the tiger are tossed around endlessly. Seeing his companion's despair, the teenager asks why God is scaring him and says that he has already lost everything he has, asking what else God wants. At the center of the storm, the duo struggles not to be thrown out of the boat. To keep them there, Pi ties the tarpaulin over their heads and stays down there, being shaken in the water until the storm passes. With things calmer, Pi gets out from under the tarpaulin and uses what little energy he has left to drink water. Thinking that Richard Parker is also thirsty, the young man goes up to the animal and pours some water into its mouth. With no hope left, Pi rests the tiger's head on his lap and tries to console it. Believing that this is the end for him, the young man begins to talk to his family and says that he is happy that he will soon meet them, shedding several tears as he thanks God for having had the chance to live. In the throes of heatstroke, Pi collapses on top of the tarpaulin and wakes up a few hours later. While trying to figure out if he is alive or not, the young man hears a noise nearby and turns to look, discovering that his dinghy has stopped on an island full of trees. Hungry, the young man begins to devour the grass and roots without stopping. Already fed, Pi wanders around the mangrove looking for Richard Parker. During his walk, the young man hears that noise again and decides to follow it, finding a large plain full of meerkats. In the biome, the young man finds a large crystal-clear natural pool and jumps in without a second thought. While he relaxes there, the tiger walks among the meerkats and eats some of them, finally satisfying his hunger. Seeing that both he and Richard Parker are fine, the young man decides to set up a bed to sleep in on top of the tree. As soon as he finishes, all the lemurs start running towards the trees while the tiger runs back to the boat. Despite his confusion, the young man remains in his makeshift camp and agrees to share a bed with the meerkats. During the night, Pi is sleeping when he wakes up to a strange light coming from underneath him. When he looks in the direction of the light, Pi sees a large number of fish floating in the fluorescent water. Looking in the direction of the boat, the young man sees Richard Parker watching him, without suspecting that from the tiger's perspective, he is near the mouth of the island, which is shaped like a person. Confused, the young man picks up a glowing plant near him and decides to open it, discovering a human tooth inside. Thinking it was crazy, Jan asked if it really was a tooth and Pi replied that the whole island was carnivorous, from the water to the soil itself. The man then claims that during the day the place was a normal island, but that during the night, the crystal clear waters turned into stomach acid, digesting everything for nourishment. Jan then asks whose tooth it was and Pai replies that it belonged to some lost person who passed by before him. Reflecting, the man says that this person thought he could spend the rest of his life on the island and took advantage of the natural resources, but that with nightfall, he was completely digested, leaving only his tooth. Back in the story, young Pai realized that there was something wrong on the island and decided to leave together with Richard Parker. Before setting off, Pai filled the boat with meerkats for the tiger and seaweed for him, as well as plenty of water. With everything ready, he blew the whistle to call the tiger back and left the island, sure that this was a respite from God, as well as a message for him to continue on his journey. With his energy reinvigorated, the young man set off back to the ocean, arriving on the coast of Mexico after 227 days of being totally lost. Even though he was extremely weak, Pai entered the water and began to drag the dinghy onto the sand. As soon as he got out of the water, the young man fell to the ground and lay there unable to move. Almost as weak as him, Richard Parker also gets out of the dinghy and stretches his legs, but manages to get enough strength to walk towards the forest, disappearing forever. A few hours later, a group of fishermen arrived on the beach and started carrying Pai to safety, making the young man cry with relief at surviving, but also with sadness that the tiger had abandoned him without looking back. At the end of the story, the survivor tells the writer that he has suffered a lot during his life, but that what hurts the most is the fact that he never got to say goodbye to those he loved. Neither Ananda, his parents, or even Richard Parker. After listening to everything, Jan says he found the story impressive and asks permission to write about it, receiving Pai's confirmation. Just then, a woman arrives with 2 children and Pai introduces them as his wife and children, revealing that after everything, he has still managed to start a family. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.